Hello, welcome to helpyourmath.com.
In this lesson, we're going to discuss about exponents. And this is part one of our lesson of exponents, and it's the introduction to the product rule. So let's look at the properties of exponents. The figure here shows a square and a cube. So each of these sides is 1.5 centimeters. So a square, the area of the square is 1.5 squared. So that means it's to the second power. Where the cube, the volume of the cube is 1.5 times 1.5 times 1.5, which means it's to the third power or cubed. So because the area of the square is 1.5, we say that anything to the second power is x squared. And similarly for our cube, where we say things are cubed if x is to the third power, and we call that x cubed. So exponents and the vocabulary associated with them are topics that we will study in this section. So let's see if you can do the following. So why don't you take out a pencil and paper and see if you can multiply x to the fifth power times x to the third power. Now don't worry if you can't, because we will learn about this in these lessons. So let's see how we can do this. And this would be, in this case, we multiply, and if you've learned it before, you know that if you multiply exponents, you add up the exponents, and that will give you x to the eighth. Now see if you have learned or remember how to do division. So if we divide y to the ninth divided by y to the fourth. So just see if you can do it or you remember how to do it. And also remember, if you don't, that's okay, because we're going to go over it or learn it in these lessons. Well, in the case of division, we're going to subtract 9 minus 4, here's where the 9 is, and minus 4. So 9 minus 4 will give us y to the fifth. And then finally, here we have an exponent, or a power to a power. And if you haven't learned it before, don't worry about it. We're going to learn it. And if you have, just see if you remember how to do it. And that when we have a power to a power, we multiply, so it's 3 times 2, and that will give you x to the sixth. So in our first example, what we looked at was a situation that used something called the product rule. And the product rule we want to keep the same bases, and if the bases are the same, we add the exponents. So that means, notice that this is the base where the x's are. These are called the bases. And if they are the same, we can add the exponents. So that's m plus n, where we get that from here. So for example, this just shows how it works. So here is x cubed, 1, 2, 3 x's, and x to the fourth, 1, 2, 3, 4 x's. So if we add those, this would be x cubed plus 4 3 plus 4, and that would give us x to the 7th. So when you multiply powers, you add the exponents. So let's look at a few exercises. So here we have y to the 7th times y to the 3rd. Well, as I said, you just add up when you have y is the same, y is the same. So that means we just have to add up these exponents. And of course, 7 plus 3 is equal to 10. So we get y to the 10th. For example, number 5. Now, if you don't see an exponent here, we assume that that is 1. So that means, what this means is that this is a to the 10th, and this is a to the 1st, so that's 10 plus 1, which will give us a to the 11. For number 6, here we notice even though they're not letter bases, they're number bases, the bases have to be the same, and these two are the same. So the base is 2, so all we're going to do is add up the exponents as we did before and keep the base the same. So there we have the 2 is our base because the 2's are the same, and 2 plus 3, and that gives us 5. So finally we get 2 to the 5th. In example number 7, well, here we have an issue because we have x to the 5th and y to the 3rd. Now, there's an issue because our bases are different. So that means that we cannot simplify this any further. So that's important to note, and you must be very careful to make sure that when you're doing the product rule and you're adding up the bases, adding up the exponents, that your bases are the same. Number 8, well, here we have not just 2, we have 3 bases that are the same. So that will mean that we add up 7 plus 3 plus 6, because we have the 3 bases are exactly the same, so that means we get b to the 16. And then in example number 9, again, you want to be very careful of your bases, because here we have x's and here we have y's. So we can add up our x's, 12 plus 6, and then our y's, 10 plus 4. So that means we have our x's add up to 18, so that's x to the 18th, meaning the power on our x's. And our y's, the power on our y's, add up to 14th, and we cannot simplify this any further. So when we're multiplying a monomial by a monomial, we want to determine the sign, and then we want to multiply the coefficients, and then we want to multiply the letters by adding the exponents for like bases. So let's look at some examples to understand what these instructions mean. So let's look at example number 10. So here we have this particular problem. So why don't we work this out on the whiteboard and see how this is done in detail using these rules. In example number 10, we have negative 2 x to the 6th, y to the 4th, times 6x squared y cubed.
So what I'm going to do to organize it, I'm going to put all my number terms in one bracket. 2, all my number parts there, 2. And I'm going to put my x's in another bracket. x6, x squared, so 2, negative 2 and 6, x6, x squared, and then my y's, y to the 4th, y to the 3rd, y to the 4th, y to the 3rd. So I see that negative 2 times negative 6 is negative 12. And then I use my exponential property for this, so I add them, 2, and then my y, 4 plus 3, and that's going to be equal to negative 12, x to the 6th, y to the 7th. And now I have multiplied my two monomial terms with exponents.
In reviewing what we just did on the whiteboard in example number 10, what we did is we collected up the coefficients, negative 2 times 6, so here are coefficients, here are x's, and we added up their exponents since it's multiplication, and our y's, and we added up our exponents, and then we put it together, and that's how we got our final answer. In example number 11, well, let's work this also out on the whiteboard in more detail.
In example number 11, I have the two monomials, negative 7, a cubed, b to the 8th, and then negative 4, a squared, b squared. So again, I'll put my numbers in one bracket, and I'll put my a's in another bracket, put my b's in another bracket, and now I'm going to use my product rule for these two, but I'll just use regular multiplication here. And I find negative 7 times negative 4 is positive 28. And then I use my product rule here where I have a, 3 plus 2, and then my product rule here for b, where I have 8 plus 2. So I finally get 28. A, 3 plus 2 is 5. And then 8 plus 2b is 10. And that's my final answer.
In reviewing what we just did on the whiteboard in number 11, here we have our coefficients. And remember that a negative times a negative is equal to positive. Here I have my a's, so I added up my exponents, and my b's, and I added up my exponents. So I got positive 28, and of course 3 plus 2 is 5, and 8 plus 2 is 10 for the b's power. In number 12, well, here we have a fraction, and yes, fractions do happen. So let's work this out on the whiteboard in more detail.
In number 12, I have the monomial 10x, y, z, and then I have 1/2 x squared z. Now, fractions happen. So even though there's a fraction there, you could still do the number multiplication. 10 times 1/2. So I put that in one bracket. Then I look for my x's. I have an x from here. I have an x from here and an x squared. And this is to the first power. And then I have 1y. So I'll put a y here. And then I have 2 z's. So I have z, z. So now 10 times 1/2 is the same thing as saying 10 over 2. And 10 over 2 is equal to 5 because 2 goes into 10 5 times. So that means I will get 5. Now let's look at this. X. This x is 1. First power plus 2. And then y. Don't have to worry about it. And then the 2 z's are each to 1 power, so it's 1 plus 1 using our product rule. And now I have 5 x to the third, y, z to the 2, and I'll just write 5 x cubed y z squared.
So, in reviewing what we just did on the whiteboard in example number 12, here I did my coefficients, and as you see, it's 10 over 2. That's what 10 times 1/2 means. And then I have my x's, and then my y's. I only have y to the first power. That's all I have here. And then I have my z's, and I have 2 of them, and all of them to the first power, so it's 1 plus 1. And then I put it together to get my final answer. In example number 13, well, we have now 3 monomials. So let's go over to the whiteboard and work this out in more detail.
In number 13, we have negative 2, 8 to x to the 8th, y. We have negative 3 x squared, z to the third. We have negative 5 y cubed, z to the 7th. And what I'm going to do, as usual, I'm going to take, even though we have 3 different monomials, I'm going to take all my number terms and put that again in one bracket. Negative 2, negative 3, negative 5. And then I'm going to look at my x's, all my x's, and I'll put my x's in another bracket. X to the 8th, x squared. And then I will put my y's in still another bracket. 1y here, no y's there, and a y cubed here. So I have y cubed. And then finally, I'll collect up all my z's. I have no z's here. I have z cubed here. And I have z to the 7th here. So now I'll start multiply. Well, here I have a negative 2 times a negative 3, and that will give me a positive 6. And then I have a positive 6 times a negative 5, and that'll give me a positive 30. Then for my next part, I have x 8 plus 2 using my product rule. And the next one here, I have y 1 plus 3. And finally, my z's, I have 3 plus 7. And then I'll carry the 30 down, and x 8 plus 2, well, that will give me x to the 10th. And then 1 plus 3, y to the 4th. And then finally, 7 plus 3, z to the 10th. And that's my final answer. In reviewing what we just did on the whiteboard in number 13, as you see, we have the coefficients, so I gathered them up into coefficients, and a negative times a negative makes a positive, but then multiplied by another negative will make a negative. And then I took my x's and gathered up my x's and added the exponents, my y's and added the exponents, and my z's and added the exponents. So I get as my final answer negative 30, x to the 10th, y to the 4th, z to the 10th. Thank you very much. I hope you liked this video and that this has helped you understand a little about exponents. Now we're going to go on to the second part of exponents, which will be in the next video. Thank you again.